application, but my first question was, where's the van? Who's going to supply the van? We had no van. We waited till the next year, went in, had the van, and we, as you all know, have 2 Mamo vans now. So it's those kind of things, just thinking about it and thinking about the project and thinking it through. So where to begin? So the first place you should always begin with any grant application is to read the entire funding opportunity announcement. Even dealing with the budget, when you read the announcement, you should read on there, look at the key dates. Sometimes there are dates that are not just the application dates. You might have to turn in a letter of intent or some other information prior to submission. Sometimes there are pre-submissions that you have to submit when doing grant applications. So even dealing with the budget, so I just wanted to put that in there. You should begin by looking at that. Another key element for the letter of intent would be, does it have to be signed by your funding agent, by your signatory for your institution? A lot of times they do not, and the faculty member can submit them on their own, but it is in that funding opportunity announcement that's going to tell you that. We have on this campus had where someone submitted a letter of intent, the faculty member submitted it on their own, but it needed to be signed by our institutional authority, so the grant was not accepted. So it's those little nuances in reading that information and knowing what's in there that will help you to guide you with not only building the budget, but also your timeline and building the whole application. Eligibility and who can apply for an application. Before you delve into a budget, there are oftentimes eligibility requirements, and there are times where you have to receive institutional approval before you can even apply for an application. So those things also go into play. You don't want to waste your time building a budget and going through a whole process if you're not eligible to apply or the faculty member is not eligible to apply. Budget planning may require that you receive, depending on what the scope of work is, if we're going to purchase equipment or there are other things that need to be purchased by vendors, that you receive estimates from the vendors. When you receive an estimate, a bid estimate, you should also include in their sales tax. That's one of the key things that on this campus for research, a lot of times sales tax is not included in the quote, and that should be included. We are, as a campus, exempt from sales tax for clinical care equipment items, but not research. And so a lot of times departments have to pick that up for sales tax, and depending on the equipment, it could be thousands of dollars. So that's very key. It may require you to review previous expenses from another project. So if there's another project where there are previous expenses and you're going to have like expenses with the same vendor, you may want to review what that scope of work was, what those expenses were, and how it relates to the grant and the application that you're completing now. If you're going to be using core facilities, then you should obtain the current core rates, or look, depending on when the budget will be approved or starting the application, you may need to go to the core directors and say, will you have a different rate next year? Because they fluctuate. The rates go up and down. And so you want to make sure that you include the rate in your application that your grant is going to be charged for that. So that's key. Also, the sales tax, what I said in the quote, is a sales tax. Whoops. Typo, have to fix that. So the purpose of the budget is to demonstrate how much the project will cost, and it shows the funders exactly what they'll support and where the money will go. And so that's key. When you're building a budget, you are also thinking about the person that's going to be reviewing it on the other end. So it should not only make sense to you, it should make sense to the reviewers. It should be easily identifiable and relatable to the project. You should also, it serves as a plan for your organization and how the project will operate. So it's also a plan internally for UAMS on, here's a project the faculty member has, here's the scope of work. Do they have everything included in there? Or do they have all the staff, the salaries? Do they have the equipment? Do they have what is needed to do the scope of work, because when we sign off as an institution, we are telling the sponsor, the funding agency, that we have the ability to complete that work. And so all those kind of things go into the budget and in the review process. And it also serves as a basis for the end of the grant report. So when you get to the end of the grant, you're going to go back, you have to go through the budget, what was spent, what costs were allocated, and also the progress report that the faculty member has to do should tie to those expenses as well, and show that yes, we completed the scope of work, we completed the items that we said we would do, and this is how we did it. And so that's part of the process. So when you talk about grant budgets, for me, I think when you talk about who, what, when, where, and how, and that's kind of the mnemonic of a lot of starting an article or a story, and so that's kind of what I want to talk about. So your budget must be able to stand on its own and answer questions about your proposal. You don't want your grant budget to raise questions. You want it to stand on its own. You want it to be identifiable and something that, as a reviewer reviews a grant application, they can look at the budget and they can relate it to the application and go, okay, that makes sense. But you don't want it to have something on there that is not in the application or written somewhere, so they're like, well, what's this? I don't understand, because that will cause reviewers to pause on the application. So a grant budget, it looks like a good news article is what I attribute it to. So by using the familiar mnemonic, who, what, where, when, why, you'll write a good story. Basically, your grant application and your budget will be a story of matching what the story is in your application. So who's going to carry out the project? So that's something when you're building the budget or you're meeting with faculty, that is key. Faculty, staff, consultants, students, they all have a place in the budget, and who's going to be a part of it is very, very key. Also, and when you're thinking about staff, don't forget about support staff and supervisory staff. So they may only spend a little fraction of time on a project. Maybe a lab tech is going to do one little thing, but if they're going to work on the project, they need to be included. And so that's key. Graduate students, if you're going to have students on there, you need to include the tuition and fees for their stipends. You need to get that information updated annually. It changes, so you would need to get that from the graduate school to get the most up-to-date information. For postdocs, if there's postdocs on the budget, then you should use NIH salary guidelines for postdocs. For UAMS, our lowest guideline that we're doing now is a postdoc 0 level, which is the 47,484, which is part of the FLASA rule that was coming out that is now in litigation from last year. But it's important to note that that's still in litigation. It's on pause for right now, but if it were to move forward, then if you don't have your postdocs at the right salary level, you're either going to have to raise them to a higher salary level or pay them overtime for all the hours they work. And as a lot of you know, postdocs work a ton of hours. So right now, UAMS's stance is that for any postdoc, regardless of their level, the minimum is 47,484 for a postdoc in budgeting, and so that's important to note when you're building new budgets. What should be included in the budget? You should list all your direct expenses, supplies, postage, mailing expense, shipping. A lot of times some work is done off campus. If you have to rent space, that can also be included as a direct cost. All those kind of items need to be looked at and talked about when you're developing the budget as well. Service fees, equipment, transportation, if you're going to travel for your project. I know there there are some projects on campus where they do a lot of travel, in-state travel, and so it's important that you know the travel regulations, that you know what the costs are, the fees are. If you don't, you can go to the website, the rules about whether to rent a car versus driving your own vehicle and how those costs will impact your budget. All those are things that play into that as well. So those are key elements. Service contracts for equipment. If equipment is being purchased, then you should also include the service contract, or show how in the application the service contract will be covered if it's not going to be covered by the grant, if it's going to be something that's supported by the institution or something like that. But you should include it, and you should also have a quote or bid to know what those costs are. Indirect costs. So indirect costs are the expenses that you can't justify being on your grant. Indirect costs are things that would normally happen even if you did not have this grant. So for indirect costs for UAMS, for computers, you come to work and your staff has a computer every day, and they have telephones and the electricity to turn on the lights and space and all those kind of things that we have to normally cover regardless of the grant. Then those are normally expenses that would not be considered to be allowable on the grant, and those are attributed to indirect costs. Rent, utilities, insurance, those kind of things. Hi, come in. So when will your project take place? That's very important. The project period and the budget periods should clearly be defined, and those are not always the same. So that's key. But you should also know the budget periods, because if it crosses fiscal years, that can also impact your budget for faculty salaries, for staff salaries, for increases. So you need to make sure that you're aware of that as well. And when you need certain items to conduct the scope of work, that should inform the budget and the time points. So what I mean by that is, say you have a 5-year project, and in year 3 you're adding a biostatistician, or you're adding another component or element to your scope of work, then at that time point is when you would add that person and those things to the budget. You would not show it in all 5 years. And a lot of times when we're looking at budgets, sometimes you see that, and they will have the same amount for those items for years 1 through 5, even though it's not really starting till year 3. You would only want to show that in year 3, 4, and 5. So that's another key component. Where? So the location of the project can be expressed in several different ways, and where the project is completed has a big impact on your budget. So again, rent, if you're not doing it on campus and you're doing it somewhere else, you're going to have to consider rent and utilities for the space. And then you'll also have to consider the occupancy costs and how that could impact your indirect costs. One thing that I really want to talk about, though, for your project and the budget as a whole is our campus indirect rate versus off-campus indirect rates, and knowing when that's applicable. So if you're doing some work that is here on campus, on UAMS campus, then we have our on-campus rate. But if there's some work that's being done elsewhere and it's off-campus, there is another rate that's off-campus rate. And all of that is listed out on the ORSP website, the whole list of our agreement with our cognizant agency and what those rates are. But that can also impact your total budget, because sometimes when you have a budget that is a total indirect and direct cost total, say $500,000, then that's going to let you know how much you have in direct cost to spend and how much you have in indirect cost to spend to get to that total $500,000. So sometimes budgets are not set up where it's direct and indirect, it's just direct cost. But it just depends. It depends on the sponsor and the funding agency. So if it's one where the total amount is, that makes a big difference, and you should make sure that you have those. So how? So in addition to the sponsor for whom you're preparing this budget and other sponsors, if they're sub-awards, how do you expect to support the project? That's very, very key in saying, if you have sub-awards, or even you have faculty that are in other departments that are here on campus, you should have a commitment from that faculty member and from their department that they will be on the project and what their scope of work will be, and that their effort is appropriate for what their scope of the work will be. So that's very important. And also for sub-awards. So if you have another institution that is going to be part of the project, then you would need a letter of intent, and you would need a commitment from that institution stating that yes, they're going to be a part of the project, and what their commitment is going to be. Are they going to be doing a scope of work and we're going to be paying for salaries and fringe, or are they just going to be a consultant where they're as needed basis, we're just going to call them and ask them questions because they have expertise in a certain area that it's going to support the project. So footnotes, justifications, and narratives are the why of the mnemonic of the who, where, what, when, why. So sometimes everything it can't be known from the numbers alone. You can't understand it. So you should explain the cost for each person, or and what their scope of work is on the project in the budget narrative. And that's key, that you have what that person's title is, what they're going to be doing, and what their role is, what their effort is going to be on the project. That should all be in the budget justification. And it should match and it should align with what was written into the scope of the project as well. You should provide rationale for allocations and for what's going to be done and what's going to be used on the project, and outline that in the budget narrative, and stating if there's a reason why you're going to be using specific people or specific I want to say isotopes for some reason, so I'll just say that. Whatever the case may be, whatever specific thing that you're going to use, if it's something that's outside the normal, you need to outline that in the justification and state why you're using this and why it's part of the project. And that helps tie the budget together with the project and make sense to the sponsor and the funder so that they all go together.
Renee, while you're on that
Sure.
subject, one thing you have to be careful of is just because you put it in the application, just because you're going to need it, doesn't mean the sponsor will approve that cost.
Correct.
So you have to know what your sponsor is going to approve. And the federal government's really bad about saying, normal costs are allowed. Well, then you have to know what it is they consider to be a normal cost. For instance, you may put secretaries or pens, pencils, or whatever, because you're going to need those things in your grant. And the application may get approved, but they're still not allowable cost. We had an award here not too many years ago. They had $20,000 of office supplies in their application. The application was funded, everything was approved, everything was wonderful, and the sponsor came in and said, oh, by the way, that $20,000 you have in office supplies, that's not allowable, you need to get that out of there now. And so they had to do an amendment after the fact to get those things changed. So even though you need it, even though it's allowable for the project, it may not be allowable for the sponsor. So you need to figure out what all that is, but you don't want to include things that they're going to kick out after the fact.
Right, and that's part of reading the funding announcement. And part of the funding announcement, there is a section for the budget, and that will talk about what's allowable, what's not allowable, depending on the project. There are some projects that are large program projects that do allow administrative costs and do allow some of those things. But for the most part, smaller funding agencies and small R series grants do not allow things like Janet's talking about office supplies and computers and things like that. You have to have a justification for that. And I talk a little bit more about that going forward in unlike circumstances. The other thing for the narrative is it serves as documentation of how you arrived at the cost. So not only should you be able to demonstrate and show what your costs are, but in the narrative, you're going to show how you arrived at it. So like for travel, you're going to show, I have 5 people traveling, this is where they're traveling, and this is the cost that we estimate it's going to be. Or for gas, mileage, those kind of things, that that you're able to demonstrate that, and it ties together with your project. So some tips. The project narrative and the budget must be consistent, as I talked about. Follow the sponsor's directions. That was more about what Janet was talking about, that you should read their instructions and know what their parameters are regarding the budget, what's allowable, what's not allowable. If you have a question and you're not certain, contact the sponsor. For NIH, most of it you would contact either Grants Accounting, or you could contact us in OSPAN or ORSP. They will know and be able to assist you with what's allowable and what's not allowable. But for smaller funding agencies, sometimes we have to reach out to them because it's not well defined in their RFA. And so there may be things that the faculty member or you may want for your project that you're not certain about. So contact them and get that information before it's due and while you're in the planning stage. So that way you know exactly what you can and cannot have on the project. Don't wait till the last minute. And again, the budget and the justification must tell the story of your project and stand alone. They should be able to, if someone were to read just your budget narrative and your budget, they should be able to see what your research is about, see what the project is about. And have more than one person proofread your budget justification and your budget. The more eyes that you have looking at these things sometimes, the easier it is to find the smallest of mistakes. Be consistent with your formatting and numbers, dollar signs, decimals, commas, calendar months. A lot of times in budget narratives, you can see where sometimes they have been pulled together from many different budgets or projects, and they're not consistent, and they should be. They should all be consistent in the same format, and they should be easy to read. Clearly justify your figures, your numbers with real bids, estimates from vendors, real travel locations, mileage, and salaries. And then the other thing I wanted to talk, a little tip is, when do you know when to use a modular budget versus a detailed budget? A modular budget is easier to use if you're going to have a smaller project and you don't have to outline every single thing that you're going to use, like supplies and salaries and all of those things. However, the cost or whatever that modular budget is should be enough to cover the project. And oftentimes we find that faculty members are trying to cut things in the project to use a modular budget. So we had someone recently that had a graduate student, and they didn't want to pay their tuition. They're like, oh, I don't want to pay their tuition. Well, if they're on their project, they should pay their tuition. They're like, well, I can't afford that. Well, then maybe you need to use a detailed budget. You need to go up. Instead of using a $250,000 modular budget, you should do a detailed budget and cover the cost that you need. You may not need $500,000. That's fine, but you can detail it out, and maybe you need $300,000 or you need $350,000. It makes sense to go ahead and do that to make sure that you have the funds to cover the project and the scope of work that you're going to do, than to try to push and condense everything down into a modular budget just so it's easier to complete. So that's just one of the things we see a lot of. And so the true test is, if someone cannot understand your project from reading your budget, it still needs work. So if they can't understand what you're going to do, if you're going to be using mice, or you're going to be using core facilities, or you're going to purchase a piece of equipment and you're also going to have a equipment maintenance contract with that, and it's all over the place. If they can't understand that, then they're not going to understand your project that well either, and it still needs work. So the budget basics. So budgets must include the dollar for all phases of the project. So project planning and development, project implementation, and project evaluation. So a lot of times budgets do not include the implementation phase, and they should. So you faculty and you write a budget and you write a project and a scope of work, and you say we're going to do all these wonderful things. Well, it takes a while to gear up to those wonderful things. It takes a while for you to get to that point where you're going to be actually doing the research and doing all those kind of things. So it may be a little bit of effort only and not a lot of supplies at first, but that needs to be part of the process as well. So budgets must include dollars for the people, places, and things that you're going to use for the scope of work. So the categories for project to program expenses, direct costs versus indirect costs. So we talked a little bit about it earlier. The cost specifically related to running and completing the project are direct cost. Things that are not directly attributable to the project, those are indirect costs. So like the utilities and computers and telephones, normally, those kind of things. Like I said, we'll talk a little bit further about unlike circumstances, but for the most part, those are the two key things to help you determine what's direct versus what's indirect. Types of expenses. Allowable expenses can be charged to grants as either a direct expense or an indirect expense. So direct expenses are paid straightforwardly, directly from the grant. F&A expenses are paid by the institution and then reimbursed by the grant through a negotiated F&A rate. So what that means is, as you're doing the grant application, you're doing the budget, then the costs that are associated with the direct cost should be allowable on the grant. Things that are indirect would be the things that would come to the institution. So that depends on what our indirect cost rate is, and it depends on the funding agency. So a lot of times we have projects that we are supporting with utilities, with our computers, with telephones, with a lot of institutional expense, but we only get 8% or 10% indirect cost rate back. So it's not covering the cost of the institution. But because of the project and because the institution believes in the research, then we do those kind of things. But a lot of times we have projects that don't cover the total cost of the project. Salaries of administrative and clerical staff should normally be treated as F&A cost. That's what one of the things that Janet was talking about. Those are things that are indirect costs normally, unless you have a large program project grant. Those are all institutional costs. Office supplies, postage, local telephone, and memberships should normally be treated as F&A costs as well. Depending on the grant itself for postage, it can be an unlike circumstance. Sometimes if there are things that you're mailing out to bring in subjects, or their questionnaires or some things like that, that could be something that is allowable on the grant, but it's an unlike circumstance, and that's something that it depends kind of thing. So it was something that I would encourage you to reach out to Ty Stevens or Janet Hopper in grants accounting and talk about the project, the scope, and what that item is or what it could be, and see how you should proceed. Okay, so expenditures for general purpose equipment are unallowable as direct charges. So based on this guidance, the normal treatment of file cabinets, printers, computers, other general purpose equipment, that can't be charged to a federal grant. That's normal. But that's where there can be an unlike circumstance in the fact of computers. So if your project is something where you have to travel, or you have the need for a patient to fill out a questionnaire, or you're going to be using iPads or something for a subject to complete information, or you're traveling to a location, then that can be an allowable cost. But that, again, is one of those things that you have to have prior approval for. All costs incurred for the same purpose in like circumstances are either direct costs only or indirect costs. So what that means is, as an institution, we look at what are normal allocable expenses to grants into budgets. And so normally all those things are either like cost, and those are things that are allowable to be on your grant, or they're not allowable. They're things that should be funded by the institution or an FNA. And so those are the two categories, and that's kind of how we look at it as an institution, and in saying, okay, for the most part, salaries, fringe, all those kind of things are things that, yes, those are allowable costs. But the other things like computers and cell phones and telephone charges and other things are things that, those are things that could be normally would not be allowable, but in certain circumstances may be, and those are the kind of things that you need to check on and see. So it's not black and white, it's very gray, but it's better to ask than to assume that something is going to be a direct cost and then it either go to the funding agency and it's funding and it's not allowable, or it comes back and you try to charge it to the grant and you're not allowed to charge it. Okay, so educational institutions that receive more than $25 million or more in federal funding have to provide and file a disclosure statement called a DS-2. The DS-2 is a document that stipulates the compliance with A21 regulations and specific institutional treatment of costs. So it doesn't mandate specific cost accounting principles, but that is what we have to report to the federal government about what's our like cost versus our unlike cost in our justifications. And that's why a lot of times we have to supply justifications to grants accounting so they can have that documentation. So when we do report back to the federal government, we have our documentation of why we chose to look at this differently and why we chose to make something allowable versus unallowable that would normally not be, like cell phones, laptops, computers, those kind of things. We want to say that once a direct cost, it's always a direct cost, and once it's an indirect cost, it's always an indirect cost, but that's not really accurate. It's something that, for the most part, that's true, but again, there are exceptions, there's purposes, there's unlike circumstances where it can be different, and I just wanted to have that slide there to show you that we try to be consistent and treat things all the same, but there are gray areas and there are reasons for sometimes that something is unlike and we need that justification. Again, a telephone line is something that is used, and that would be our normal F&A cost. But if it's a telephone line where you're doing a conference call with 20 different sites at 20 different institutions, then that may be something that's allowable on the grant, because you're going to have long distance. You may have to have this conference call every week, something like that. It just depends. And so I just want you guys to look at some of the examples that it may or may not be cut and dry, and to please ask. So that way you have the best information, the faculty member has the best information, and you know that you're covered and you're taking care of what needs to be taken care of on the scope of work on the grant. I think I'm going to skip this because that's more of what we just talked about. So when we talk about computers and unlike circumstances, for the most part, I talked about computers that if you have to travel, if you have subjects that need to fill out questionnaires, those kind of things. Another unlike circumstances is if you have a computer that's attached to a piece of equipment in a lab, that is allowable. That's something that you can purchase. If there's software that's specific to that computer to run the project, software is allowable. but it's not normally. And so those are the kind of things and nuances when you're working and building a budget that you should be aware of, that it's not cut and dry, and it's, normally you would say, no, you can't purchase software. No, you can't purchase Adobe or something like that. But if it's software that's specific to running a program that's going to complete the research, then it is allowable. And so those are the kind of things to look at. The golden rule. So identification with the sponsor of this work. So rather than the nature of the goods and services involved in determining the factor is distinguishing direct from indirect cost of sponsor agreements. So that's more what we're talking about. And the golden rule is basically that we're doing our due diligence, that we have most of the things categorized into what is a direct cost versus an indirect cost. And then when there are unlike circumstances, that we have documentation that we're following through, and that we are being consistent with that as an institution.
And the golden rule is, he who has the gold makes the rule. We want their gold, so whatever they say we have to do, we will do to get their gold.
This is more what we were talking about, distinguishing between direct and indirect cost. The salary expense of an administrative assistant processing a travel expense account for a PI, that's F&A. That's not something that would be attributable to the grant. That's just something that we do normally. Whether we had the grant or not, that executive assistant is going to process that person's travel. So that's not something that can go on the grant. But the salary expense of an administrative assistant making all the arrangements for a conference could be a direct expense on a conference grant. So those are some of the nuances. Those are some of the things that, looking at expenses and looking at your scope of work, it could depend. And so those are the kind of things you want to look at. So in one instance, the action has no impact on the scope of the project, and the other, there's a direct benefit to the grant. And so those are the kind of things that you want to look at. If it has no direct impact on the scope of work of the project, then it's probably not allowable. If it does have a direct impact on the scope of work in the project, then it could be allowable. I'm not going to say is, it could be.
And the biggest problem with it is, especially if it's one of those things that is, well, we had someone call and say, can I charge the cost of replacing the fume hood on my grant? I go, well, the fume hood's necessary for that project. However, that fume hood's in a lab that 25 other people are using. So what piece of that fume hood are you using? You're putting, 3 millimeters of air through a 600 millimeter. So if you can't come down to a figure that's concrete and justifiable and understandable by all, then it's not going to be allowable on the project. Ty and I are going to say, no. Let's find something else. The time you spend working in that lab, yes, but not the fume hood itself. So it's going to depend, and that's going to be the words you hear out of mine and Ty's mouth more often than anything else. If you ask us a question, our first word is going to be, well, it depends. What are the circumstances? What are you really doing? So we have to understand what you're doing before we can tell you whether or not an expense is allowable or not allowable, which is the fun part of having grants. There are no black and white. Everything is gray.
It is gray. And the other thing to think about too, is to consider, is most infrastructure in buildings and things like that are not going to be allowable on grants. That is something, unless you have a construction grant, then all of those things, fume hoods and all of the things associated with that, that's just part of our infrastructure. We have to have that in order to do the work. So whether we had the grant or not, we still needed that. And so that would not be allowable. Unlike circumstances and things we've talked about. So it must be justified to the proposal, and it's got to be reviewed by the department, the college, ORSP prior to submission. So in grants accounting, it has to be approved if it's an unlike circumstance, because we have to have documentation. We all have to be on the same page and understanding what it is, why it's an unlike circumstance, and be able to justify that when we have to do our federal justifications for those kind of things. UAMS policy 83.17 stipulates that approval for direct expensing costs that normally would be F&A expenses will only be given for those expenses specifically identified in the justification. An approval of a specific expense does not provide blanket approval to treat other costs inconsistently. So what that means is you have to have the justification, you have to have the approval, and it doesn't always mean if you put in an application and you did not go through the process of getting approval, just because the sponsor approved it doesn't mean it's going to be approved here at UAMS, because we have to safeguard all our projects and all of the regulations. What's a good justification? Most F&A expenses are treated as indirect because they cannot be properly allocated to a specific project. And that's what Janet was talking about the fume hood. If you have something in a lab that's shared by 10 other people and you're saying, oh, I need to purchase this for my project, but it's 10 other projects are using it, you can't justify that for that project, because there's no justification for saying it's only going to be used for that one if you're using it for 10 projects. A justification for a direct charge, that the same expense would have to identify how the expense would be properly allocated to the project. So again, you have to justify how it is relatable to that project and specific, and why you should be able to allow to charge that to the project. Scope of work. The justification would be to identify how the scope of the project will be dependent upon this expense. Sometimes, like I was saying about the isotopes, or maybe we needed specific mice that cost, I don't know, 3 times more. I've seen naked mice or whatever kind of mice that have to be done, that you have to justify, why do we need this specific thing in order to carry out the work? And if you can justify it, or the faculty member can justify it, then it will be approved. But if you can't, then it won't be. And those are the kind of things.
We've had cases where we've had specialized microscopes or some specialized piece of equipment that 2 or 3 projects may be using. If you can come up with a reasonable explanation as to what percentage each one of those projects would be using that specialized equipment, then you may in fact be able to split it 3 ways or 2 ways or something. But we need something on the front end that explains how and why both of these projects will be using this equipment and how much, and give us a reason and justification for how you're splitting it. You just can't say, oh, we think we're going to use it about 10% of the time. Well, what are you basing that on? So it's a matter of, and it drives people crazy, but we need the details so that when the auditors come in, we have the details already ready. Our friends at Vanderbilt, who's the Jerry Fife, who is used to be a grants manager and he's now the CFO, I think, told the tale about Vanderbilt getting written up because they had justification, but they didn't write it down. And so the auditor said, well, they said, well, we can write it down. They said, no, justification has to be written at the time of purchase or the time of the incurring the expense in order for the feds to allow it. So even though you have it in your head, it doesn't do any good. The expense was still written off and they still had to pay the federal government back. So just be prepared.
We have some equipment maintenance contracts that, depending on the piece of equipment, is shared between a few projects, and we have that justification and we have that written down. We have a few of those that maybe the faculty member has 3 grants and they're using the same lab, but they're using it in specific projects, that they can show what portion of work is being done, and so it's split between a few projects. Those kind of things happen. We just have to have that documentation. Yeah, so we kind of touched on this of what happens if an exception arises after the award is made. It's got to be justified, and if the institution still deems that it is not an allowable expense, we're not going to allow that expense, even if the sponsor said, here you can have $20,000 for an executive assistant. We're not going to allow it. It's not going to be, if they're not doing something specific where their effort is able to be shown on that project, it would not be allowable.
Yeah, and the approval, if you're going to call the feds, the approval needs to come from the grant specialist, not the program manager. The because the program manager has no authority over the approval of financial activity. And program managers, just like us, they want the project done, so they're going to say, okay, sure, why not? Yeah, we had an instance in a grant that ended a year or two ago where the program manager saying yes, 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 and when it came down to it, the financial manager said, no, 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 give us back our $400,000. So you want to be sure on the front end that you have the right person approving it too.
So internal charges, on grants, we try not to have a lot of back and forth charges on our budgets. But if there are internal recharges that are going to happen through CORS or those kind of things, they're allowable on the grant. You should know what those charges are, and you should write those into the grant as well. So one thing that you should be aware on internal charges, though, is that campus operations, they will not charge expenses to federal grants. If a department has a need for a service from the campus operations unit, the department needs to provide a department fund and cost center or a non-federal and WBS element. So for your building in your budget, you can have it on your budget, but when you go to expense it once the award happens, you may have some problems trying to get it approved unless you have a prior approval for that.
Right, and postage that Renee talked about earlier, I think is one that's come up, and even telephones. Since campus ops is no longer billing out for those things, they're not tracking them as well either. So in order for you to have a dollar amount for what that postage was, you need to work that out on the front end with campus ops to find out how they're going to track and maintain that, so you have justification. Because you are going to have to charge the cost center originally, and then you're going to do an IDT to move it to the grant. Well, when you do the IDT, it comes to me. Everything that goes to a grant comes through me before it gets posted if it's an IDT. I need to know why, what, how did you come up with the magic number of $100.12? You know, where did this come from? Where is it in your grant? And yes, I could probably go read your application every time an IDT comes through, but thank you, but no thank you. So I need you to, if it's cut and paste from the application, fine, that's all the better. But otherwise, I need to know how many pieces were mailed out. What did it have to do with the scope of the project? Or were you just mailing out birthday cards to all your friends and neighbors and you just wanted to use UAMS's money? I need something to tell me so that I know that this relates to the scope of the work. And that's the main issue. How does this activity that you're paying for relate to the scope of the work of your project? What are you doing? And that's, I mean, you know, and everybody knows, but we have to have it in writing on a piece on the IDT somewhere so we can justify it to the auditor.
Right. So I wanted to put the admin guide policy on here for you so you can reference it when you're building your budgets. There are examples of what are allowable costs and what are unallowable, and so that's a good guide for you for our institution. And then also, if you have other issues that are gray areas, please contact Ty Stevens or Janet about any questions and to start the process.
And you can also find it in the guidance that replaced Circular 821 and 5 circulars are put in here, but the allowable cost section, it's about 30 pages in the circular that you can, and again, they're very vague, they're very gray. It says you can do this or you can do that, as long as your institution says you can. And part of that, travel is one of the issues. You know, travel regulation says you must follow your state regulations or federal regulations, whichever is more restrictive. Travel in the state of Arkansas is very restrictive. Our rates are not as high as the federal rates. You cannot use the federal rates. You cannot use the federal guidelines other than it says to follow your state guidelines. Purchasing is the same way. Okay. You follow whichever is the most restrictive. Okay.
So we haven't touched on cost sharing and how that relates to budget. So I wanted to bring up the UAMS cost sharing policy and the implications for cost share at UAMS. There are 4 types of cost share. We want to limit cost share here at UAMS to, and commitments to only those instances where cost sharing is either mandatory or deemed necessary by the department chair and or college dean. So just because a faculty member wants to write a grant to a funding agency that is going to give them $50,000 and they want to have 50% of their effort on there, the department chair and the dean have to sign off on that, because that's not a good use of the resources for UAMS. But you should establish the procedures for recording cost share in the UAMS financial system. For all cost share that on a grant has to go on a match account. So there are lots of regulations related to cost share, but for the most part for UAMS, we like to say we don't like cost share. We don't want cost share, especially voluntary cost share. But mandatory cost share, salary cap cost share, there are instances where there are grants that require it. They require a certain amount of effort from faculty for a lot of K awards and those kind of things. It's totally fine, but we don't want to do a lot of voluntary cost share. So the definition of cost share is the expenditure or use of the grantee's own resources, funds, or third-party contributions toward the total allowable cost of a sponsored project. So what that means is we have a project, we have a scope of work, we've outlined in a budget what the cost is to do that project, but we're deciding to, as an institution or the individual or as a whole, decide what we're going to put towards that project. And that's what cost share is. It's the institution's portion of supporting that project. There's 4 types. The mandatory cost share is the one that I talked about at first. So mandatory cost share is one where it is mandatory for the project. And if you don't have that cost share, some we have that are 1-to-1. So is it NSA? There's some grants where it's dollar for dollar, that if we get $50,000 from the funding agency, we have to be able to show $50,000 of match. And we sign off on those because of the research or the project or whatever, but it does have to go through a process. And so that's very key when you're building the budget. Salary cap cost share, depending on the faculty member's salary amount and the amount of effort that they're putting towards the grant. NIH salary cap just changed, and you're going to be receiving some updates about that. But the amount of their salary that is over the NIH cap, then that has to go to a match account. That is our institution's portion of cost share for that individual's effort. So if they make $200,000 a year and the salary cap cost share is $187 now, it's going up to $187. It's going up to $187,000. Everything above that $187 is our institution's cost share, our support of the project. Voluntary uncommitted cost share is not allowable, and voluntary committed cost share. So both voluntary are ones we do not like to see here at UAMS.
Are you going to get into the?
Yeah.
Yeah, the 1%.
Yeah. So mandatory cost share is the amount of grantee contribution, as I said, required by the sponsor as a condition of making the award. And it's identified in the RFA. So if it's a match, it's a 1-to-1 match, or it's its percentage or whatever it is, it'll be outlined in the RFA. You'll know that when you read it and when you're developing your budget. UAMS requires that the principal investigator commit a minimum of 1% of measurable effort to their grant. And it's defined as effort committed by the PI. So even if a grant agency says we don't allow PI effort on a grant, UAMS is going to put 1% of cost share mandatory on that grant.
And that's only on grants that have activity.
Yes.
You know, if you're buying a piece of equipment, that does not involve anyone's activity. But if you're doing a project that you're going to be spending time in a lab, even if they don't allow it, somebody's doing something, or you didn't get the grant in the first place and you're not going to succeed. So we're saying that if it requires someone to be involved in that project, then obviously somebody is, so you need to allow some of their effort. 1% was the minimum. You know, if they're spending 95% of their time on the project and you only put 1%, that's kind of stretching the facts, but, we want to see at least acknowledgement by the faculty submitting this application that, yes, we are going to be spending time, and yes, UAMS is going to support that time for that project.
Right. So there are some grants, equipment grants, we do not require any mandatory effort. Travel grants, there are some grants for meetings. We don't require effort on those. It is actual contributable effort where we can say that there's a faculty member that is head of this project, and they're the one that is ensuring that the scope of work is being completed. They are ensuring that the project is going to happen, and the funder is giving us the money to do this project, and that's our assurance to the funding agency that the project will be completed, and we do have someone working on it. Salary cap cost share is, like I said before, is when the individual salary is higher than the cap. Now, if that's for NIH and federal, there is a cap. There are some instances where there is not a cap. And so you need to read the RFA. You need to know that it's not all or nothing. So we have several foundations that do not have a salary cap. So if someone makes $500,000 a year and they put 10% effort, then it all goes on the grant. None of it goes to salary cap. So you just need to know who you're submitting to the funding agency and what their rules are. It does have to be identified for effort reporting, and it's unallowable towards mandatory committed cost share. So if there's mandatory cost share that you have to have, then the amount that is over the salary cap, that's still the institution's responsibility, and you have to be able to show and identify that other match as being something that the institution is committing beyond the salary cap. So there's a nuance with that as well. And so there's a little calculating there, and you can contact us. We can help you with those kind of instances. But that is that's really important for some grants. Let's see, can we talk about next week? So voluntary uncommitted cost share. So voluntary uncommitted cost share is not committed or budgeted for in a sponsored agreement. This cost share does not need to be reported to the sponsor, usually the result of excess effort. Voluntary committed cost share is the identified grantee contribution in excess of any mandatory cost share. And then although voluntary in nature, the cost share is committed and must be monitored in the accounting records, the same as mandatory cost share. Voluntary cost share is frequently referred to as effort provided at no cost to the grant. So what that means is, if you have research staff, or you have research nurses, or you have someone that you did not write into the grant, but they are contributing effort to that project, then that must be tracked. That effort must be tracked in a match account showing that this person was not written in, we're not receiving any funds for them, but they are putting effort to that project. We have to be able to identify that and show that as part of the project. And that is part of the cost of the project. It'll be the part of the institution's cost, not the funding agency, but we have to be able to show that and identify that. So it's very important when you're doing the budget justification and narratives, when you're writing out who's going to be part of the project and what they are going to do, that if it is someone that what they're doing is their normal everyday job. So if you have a research nurse, and that research nurse their job is every day to draw labs for someone, and that's what they do every day, all day long. It doesn't matter if you have this project or you don't, that's what their job is. Then that would be not considered cost share because that's their job. But if you have a research nurse that every day they draw labs, but today in part of your project you need them to get a height and weight, and they don't normally do that, then that height and weight is cost share because they don't normally do that, and that has to be attributed to that part of the project. So those in a clinical setting, they're very there are a lot of nuances, and again, if you're not certain, I would suggest that you contact Ty and Janet to help go through that, because as we said, there are a lot of gray areas, but there are things that can be attributed to what someone's job is and not the project. So the effects of cost share on our F&A rate, I just wanted to tell this slide as far as it makes our F&A rate go down. And so our institution right now for our F&A rate is 49.
Yeah, for research.
49 for research. It's getting ready to go up. But it's for every research dollar we get into our institution for research as a direct cost, we have another $1 or $1.50 that the institution is covering in indirect cost to support that project. So the more voluntary cost share we have, the more things that we as an institution are putting towards a project that we're not receiving funding for, that makes our indirect costs go down, meaning, well, you don't need that because you guys are already supporting what you need and you're supporting all these projects. So we can lower your cost rate because you guys don't need that additional support, but we do. So that's just something I wanted to point out. Every dollar that's spent on research increases the research base. The cost sharing expense must be included in the research base, and that increases the base result and it decreases our F&A rate. So the net impact of voluntary cost share is a decrease in the research F&A rate. So that's just something to be aware of. UAMS's policy on voluntary committed cost share. Since voluntary committed cost share consumes departmental resources, reduces the research F&A rate, and reduces available resources for additional research, UAMS does not allow the inclusion of any voluntary committed cost share in grant proposals. Exceptions may require approval of the department chair and the college dean. UAMS reserves the right to turn down the grant if the chancellor determines that the cost sharing expense is too great. So we do have cost sharing on this campus. We do have proposals with cost share. It just has to go through the approval process. So if you have a faculty member or as a faculty member, you are looking at your grant and you believe that you need additional resources, then you need to request those and go through the proper channels so that way it's included in the grant application and it's done up front. The budget considerations is the cost share required by the funding agency, is the cost share being volunteered, and what is the source of the cost share? Is it cash? Is it departmental funding? Is it in-kind, which is non-cash institutional support? Or is it third party, an outside source? So we have had instances where we've had sub-awards where faculty members are writing that they have someone at another institution that's going to do something for their grant, and there's not going to be any measurable effort. So as an institution, we try to not have those kind of agreements because we can't commit something on behalf of someone else. So that would be part of the letter of intent and part of the sub-award agreement with the other institution, that their institution signed off on that and that we have that documentation that they're going to allow that, because that's not something that as our institution can commit, but that is something that happens very, very rarely.
Can I add something? Or
Sure.
You can ask something?
No, go ahead.
So when you write when you prepare an application, and let's say your budget is 100,000, but the award is really for 50,000. So you may have like some departmental funds, or maybe you are thinking that you're going to apply to another agency for the rest of the money. How do you put that in the application? Like, do you prepare the budget as 100,000 and explain somewhere else that, I'm asking you the 50,000, I'll find a way for the other 50, or this will kill your application because the sponsor will say.
It would probably kill your application. You would have to be able to show that you have the additional. So if the scope of work is going to cost $100,000 to complete, and you're sending that to the funding agency, then you need to be able to demonstrate the $50,000 that you're giving me is going to cover this, and I have additional support for the other 50,000. Not that I hope to get it. You will have to be able to demonstrate that you have it. Yeah, because otherwise they would probably just triage it because there's no guarantee. So you would be able to, you'd have to be able to demonstrate that you have the 50,000 in departmental, and that would be by letter of the department chair, of a letter of support stating that we are going to support $50,000 and, you know, to this project, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, you would have to demonstrate that you have it.
But the budget, when you were breaking down, okay, that much for the research nurse or that much for the equipment, it would still be the total
Yes.
100.
Yes.
Full
It would,
picture.
it would still be the full picture. It would still show the full cost of the application. It would just be that this is the part that you're asking for from the funding agency, and this is the portion that you're having covered some other way. But yeah, you would show the entire cost. So this is talking about the cost share and in-kind indirect. So if a funding agency caps the amount of cost share, then that is just something that we do internally, and it's not captured as match at that point. It's just how we demonstrate that, yes, here's the cost, and this was the allowable amount of F&A that was allowed on the project by the funding agency, and we don't capture the additional as match.
But the funding agency has to approve the use of that.
Yes.
So if our rates, yeah, there you go.
So the source of funds for cost sharing con, the funding agency pays 10% indirects, and like DHHS negotiated rate is 26%. Our direct cost is $100,000. Normally the indirects, it would be 26,000, but they only paid 10, so it's 10. The unrecovered indirect cost is $16,000. And so that's, and we have to be able to show that as well.
And this is only, well, primarily used for a mandatory match. So if your match is mandatorily $26,000, you could show that $16,000 is unrecovered indirect cost. That charge is not posted anywhere, so there's no document, piece of paper, what you can show and hand to somebody. All you can show is, here's our approved rate, here's what was charged to the grant, here's the difference, and this is our match. Because it is a federally recognized expense that we've incurred, because every dollar we spend costs this much to
Right. So let me explain that a little more in detail. So for mandatory match, depending on what it is, so if it's a 1-to-1 match, and say we have to match, it's $50,000 from the sponsor, so we have to come up with another $50,000 in match, but they only allow, and our indirect cost rate was 26%, but they're only allowing 10% is what they're saying that they will cover. That's it. That's their indirect cost rate. The difference, which is the $16,000, we can apply that to our match. So we don't have to come up with that additional money. So that could be applied to our match. So waived indirect cost is something that we also dissuade, but it happens. If the PI wants to request an indirect cost waiver, they have to go, that has to go through Dr. Cornett's office and ORSP, and it has to be signed and put into the proposal before it's submitted. The cost may then be used as cost share if approved by the granting agency. And that, again, is a calculation that's off the books and won't require us to identify it. So say that, as you were talking about your $100,000 budget, and your budget is $100,000, but the funding agency only wants to give you $50,000. The award is $50,000, and you need another $50,000. You could go to Dr. Cornett, or you could go to the chancellor and say, I have this grant proposal, it's $50,000. My project's going to cost $100,000. And say they were going to give you 50% indirects. That'd be another $25,000 that you could say, can I take the indirects and apply it to my project? And that could be written into your grant budget. And if it's approved by Dr. Cornett and the chancellor, then it's possible that those monies could come back to you. And then you'd only need to find an additional $25,000. Maybe your department would cover the additional $25,000. So cost share provided by a third party must be identified in the proposal and documented for grants. And we need that documentation at grant closeout, but we also need it on the front end in the proposal process, because if we don't have documentation, then it doesn't exist. So the responsibility for funding cost share, the responsibility for identifying the funding and the cost share is assumed by the department submitting the proposal. So inclusion of effort or another department's personnel should be approved prior to submission, and funding for that effort must be identified before the award is received. And that's what I talked about before. So if you have someone that has a project, or you have a project with faculty in 5 different departments, and they have high salaries, and there's going to be salary cap cost share, then we need documentation. Who's going to cover the salary cap cost share for that effort on the grant? So if the PI is going to put, or the sub-I is going to put 10% effort on the grant, and they make $500,000 a year, that's going to be it's going to be quite a bit of money that the department is going to have to come up with to cover that cost share for that amount of effort. And so when you're dealing with other departments, you need to go to them and you need to have approval that, yes, we will pick up that salary cap cost share for this person that is going to be working on that grant. And that's required before we sign off. So that's something that when you're dealing with other departments or divisions, that you need to make sure that if someone has a salary that goes above the cap, or they're committing effort that is going to be cost share, anything like that, that it is approved by that department as well, and not just in the application. Questions? Yay. So,
I have a question.
Sure.
So it's about the graduate students.
Yep.
When you want to use a graduate student, do you by default just put up their stipend for tuition in, or what are the different ways that you can use a graduate student? We don't do effort, right? Or yes.
It depends.
Depends. No, they can have effort. So sometimes it depends. So a graduate student, depending on the faculty member, maybe the faculty member has 2 grants. If the faculty member has 2 grants and they're using that graduate student on both grants 50-50, then half of it can be on one and half can be on the other. Half the tuition can be on one, half the tuition can be on the other. Or they could say, well, I want all the tuition on this. We had that recently where the tuition wasn't split. It doesn't have to be split, because how the tuition is cyclical with the semesters, that this graduate student, so when they were working on this one project, that's when it was time for their tuition to be due. When they were on the other project, it was in the summer, and that's not when they were paying tuition. So one project paid the entire amount, but they still had their effort split. So there isn't a set policy on that. They should show effort. They just won't have fringe. But if they're contributing effort, they should show that. Now, there are instances, and you may be talking about the RPPR, which is not the budget, but the back end, and showing that someone had a graduate assistant working on a project and they didn't charge anything to the grant for that. That may be the instance that you're talking about. And that happens because the College of Medicine is picking up that tuition for them for the first 18 months that they're in graduate school. So it is possible that they did have attributable effort in the RPPR when we are demonstrating that who worked on the project, but we didn't request any salary for them.
Especially if they're not employees, they should
Yes.
not appear on the staff benefit report. If they are not employees, they should be getting paid through purchasing, not through payroll. If you're not paying them anything and it's just tuition, then that'll come in through your other expenses for grants and aids. But we've had, on this campus, for the last 20 years, we've had a fight over what to do with grad students. Because our former payroll officer, who's no longer with us, said that if the grad student was in the lab, then they were earning payroll, then you had to pay it through payroll. And he determined that they were earning a wage and therefore it should be reported as payroll. The philosophy really is if they're on a stipend, that is a stipend. It is not payroll. They should not be paid through payroll. They should be paid through purchasing.
They're students.
They're students. They're not employees. Now, it's different if you have a employee that goes and gets a fellowship or goes and becomes a postdoc, then you are paying salary. But that's separate from their grant they've gotten as a postdoc. So we have to determine what the person is and what they're doing and how we pay them. And you might be paying them tuition and salary, but that would be a different issue than just a postdoc that's strictly a student. But that would come into your calculation.
Sure.
Question to clarify. So can a grad student then have effort on a grant but no tuition?
They can, but it's rare. And then we would ask that if they're on a grant and they have effort.
Are they employees? Are they paid? They may not show effort if they're not paid through the payroll
Well, they're going to show if they're requesting a stipend. If they're requesting a stipend on the grant, then they're going to show the amount of the stipend.
But that wouldn't be
Yes,
recorded.
so
It
it's
shouldn't be
it's
recorded
a
as
stipend. It
effort.
would be a
No.
stipend.
It's not recorded as effort, but, and I know I'm using the wrong vernacular and I'm driving you crazy, Janet, but
Yes.
they do not have to have tuition on there, but then the college, the graduate school is going to ask who's going to cover the tuition, because normally when they have a grad stipend, then the tuition is covered by the department or that faculty member, but it does not have to be on the grant itself. But somewhere, there should be a plan to cover that tuition for that student.
Has the salary cap to 187 gone into effect already?
Yes and no.
I'll let
Because
you
the
know.
current administration hasn't passed the budget, NIH has not put out, well, yesterday they put out a interim rule that says, yes, as of January 8th, the salary cap changed.
Okay.
They told us, what was it, the 21st is when they decided to share that information.
Right. So they just told us that the last couple days. That's why I was looking at Janet and she was looking at me trying to remember exactly what the number is. I believe it's 187. We will be sending out communication about that shortly, about when we're going to put it in effect for current awards and then also moving forward for new applications.
I
So
think Suzanne said that TRAX was being updated.
right, TRAX is being updated with the new amount. So I'm not sure when that will be complete. She hasn't said that yet. So that will be for new applications. For applications that are already awarded, we're going back to February 1
Yeah.
instead of using January 8th, which would be a nightmare to try to calculate
Split
and
them up.
split the month. We're going to use February 1st. So all awards that are already awarded, then February 1st, we will start with the new salary cap amount.
And since payroll has to be put in today, I think is the
Yes,
day,
so
we're not expecting to see
No.
any of that until April.
in April, we'll send out communication in the first part of April, and then retros can be made for budgets to do that.
If you're putting in an application right now into TRAX.
You're going to use whatever's in TRAX,
Suzanne will actually
override it.
manually change it for you. Just
Okay.
ask her.
She'll override it for you. So if you're putting in an application now, it can be they can override it to the new one until the code is written with the new amount. Any other budget questions?
I think one thing that we didn't really cover was if you have subawards, which can be super, you could probably do a whole nother presentation on subawards.
Yes, I just barely touched on it, I know.
But I think one important thing to bring up is you have to include their whole package, F&A and everything, in your directs. So be careful if you have limited directs, because that can eat up how much money you have to spend real quick.
So that depends on the funding agency. Sometimes it does go into your direct cost, and but for the most part for NIH, it's only the first 25,000. So the first $25,000 of the subaward, that's going to eat into your direct cost. Other than that, it's not. But there are some instances and some proposals where it doesn't. It's separate from your direct cost. Again, you have to read your RFA. And yes, I could do a whole other presentation on it, so that's why I just touched on that. But it is important to know, and when you're doing an application, to, again, read the RFA, know what your subawards are, and know how that's going to impact your direct cost and your
Because
indirects.
the subaward E, UAMS has a fairly low F&A rate.
Mhm.
I don't think 49% is horrible.
Yeah, some
We
are
have places
75.
that have 85, 90. I think Ty told me here somebody had 110%, and I want to know how
I want to know that too.
But anyway, so, but you have to allow them to get their full indirects on their directs. We only get indirects on the first 25,000 of their expenses. But if they don't have an indirect cost rate, they have written into the new legislation that you can allow them to use a 10% rate. If they're a small mom and pop shop or somebody that's just never gotten an indirect cost rate, they are allowed to use 10% as their rate that you would calculate into their expenses.
Well, and to read whether or not their indirects count towards your total cap.
Right.
Yeah,
So that's the key, to read the RFA and know whether the indirect costs that are going to the other institution that you're being charged, whether they count towards your cap of direct costs. So if you're capped at $500,000 or $250,000 for a modular, then you need to know that, because that's going to impact your budget as well.
We have a question from someone away from us.
Okay.
A different location. For people that are applying to grants but don't currently have a grant, what type of support does UIMS offer for developing, reviewing budgets?
Oh. We have a lot of support. So we have OSPAN, is our Office of Sponsored Programs Administrative Network. We have some brochures. We have a website you can go to. Depending on which college you're in, you can contact me, and we can put you with the person that's responsible for helping you with your proposal. So our staff goes and starts working with faculty at the time that they come up with the idea and work through the whole proposal process. We also have SciComm, which is our grant editors and writers that will work with faculty in getting their application edited and ready for submission. We have a project person that works in that office, Betty Cook, that works on the budget, and she does the project management for large project program grants and even R01s. So they go meet with the faculty's team for the grant application, and they will handle all of the budget elements in helping to come up with the costs and identifying who, what, where, when, why, how, and all of those things. So we have total support for that.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I would be remiss if I don't plug our next talk, which is next Wednesday. We're actually having an informational roundtable on K Awards. So if you're interested in applying to K Awards, please attend that. It's from 11 to 1, and it will be at the Joe Ellen Ford Auditorium next Wednesday. Thank you, Renee.
Thank you.
And those of you that came in late, here's a sign-in sheet.
We all ready?
Sorry, I got my
Once you have the direct cost.
Yes.